Thomas Sankara, the seed of a revolution. Burkina Faso, a name that means land of upright people. But before it was known by this proud title, the country was called Upper Volta, a remnant of colonial rule, a land scarred by poverty, corruption, and foreign control. It was here in a dusty little town called Yako that a boy was born in 1949. His name was Thomas Sankara. From a young age, Sankara saw injustice not as something distant, but as part of daily life. He saw people bowing to French officials' children dying of hunger, while warehouses full of aid remained locked behind government doors. Sankara understood early freedom doesn't come from promises, it comes from action. Born into a modest family with access to education, he stood out early, while other boys dreamed of becoming military officers for the power it gave. Sankara questioned that very power. When he was sent to Madagascar for military training, he didn't just study tactics. He witnessed revolution in 1972 as a popular uprising toppled a corrupt regime. Young Sankara walked the streets filled with protest and fire, and something inside him awakened. If it can happen here, he thought, why not in my homeland? Upon returning to Upper Volta, Sankara quickly rose through the military ranks. But he wasn't like the others. He rejected privilege. He spoke of justice, gender equality, and land reform. He condemned neocolonialism. While others enjoyed official cars and private compounds, he rode a bike and lived simply. When the government cracked down on striking workers, he resigned in protest. He was gaining a reputation not as a career politician, but as a dangerous idealist. But Sankara was not alone. At his side stood Blaise Compaoré, a fellow soldier, a trusted friend, a man who shared his early ideals. In 1983, as political chaos gripped the country, the two staged a bloodless coup. At just 33 years old, Sankara became president. One of his first acts was to change the country's name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso. A new era had begun. Sankara was unlike any African leader the world had seen. He slashed his salary, banned luxury cars, and refused to let officials exploit public funds. He drove a modest Renault 5, the cheapest car in the country. He banned costly ceremonies and lived as a true servant of the people, but he didn't stop there. He launched a massive vaccination campaign, immunizing over 2 million children against deadly diseases in just a few weeks. He led a national reforestation effort to fight desertification. He called on women to rise, banning forced marriages, promoting female leadership, and encouraging women to join the army. He electrified the youth, stunned his opponents, and inspired a continent, but his boldness made him a target. He refused aid with strings attached. He called out the hypocrisy of global institutions. At a summit of African leaders, he challenged them to reject debt, calling it a form of modern slavery. Foreign powers took notice. Former colonial rulers grew uneasy. Local elites, landowners, generals, businessmen felt threatened. And in the shadows, a betrayal was brewing. No one felt the distance more than Blaise Compaoré. The once loyal brother-in-arms now found himself sidelined. Sankara had become fiercely independent, increasingly radical and difficult to influence. Compaoré, once his closest ally, now stood in his shadow. They still appeared together in public, but their eyes told a different story. Sankara burned with vision. Compaoré simmered in silence. Foreign ambassadors, corporate agents, and disgruntled elites began to look at Compaoré not as a threat, but as a solution. Whispers turned into plans. Plans turned into movements, and movements prepared to strike. Thomas Sankara wasn't naive. He knew the risks. He once said, while revolutionaries as individuals can be murdered, you cannot kill ideas. He was ready to die. But what he may not have expected was that the bullet would come from someone who once called him brother. And so in October 1987, the shadow of betrayal began to fall across the presidential palace. Chapter 2. The Day of Betrayal, October 15th, 1987. The sun rose gently over Ouagadougou on October 15th, 1987. It was a Thursday like any other, or so it seemed. But beneath the calm surface, something was stirring. The streets were quieter than usual. The faces of soldiers at checkpoints more stern. In the corridors of power, a betrayal was taking shape. At the presidential compound, Thomas Sankara prepared for his weekly meeting with the National Revolutionary Council. He wore his usual fatigues. Nothing fancy, nothing grand, just the uniform of a man who had never stopped seeing himself as a servant of the people. He didn't bring bodyguards. He never did. He believed that fear was the enemy of revolution and that true leaders should walk among their people, not hide behind walls. Around 4:30 p.m., he stepped into the meeting room along with 12 of his most trusted aides. They were friends, comrades, fellow dreamers. They talked about upcoming policies, community projects, ways to deepen the revolution. No one knew these would be their last words together. Outside, a group of armed men quietly moved into position. They weren't strangers. They weren't foreign invaders. They were soldiers, Burkinabe soldiers, many of whom had once cheered for Sankara, once saluted him with pride. But now they followed other orders. Orders whispered in secret meetings. Orders signed not by courage, but by fear. Suddenly, a burst of gunfire shattered the air. Bullets tore through the compound walls. Sankara stood up calmly and reportedly said, "Stay calm, it's me they want." He stepped forward unarmed, no shield, no resistance, just a man. One who had always believed that ideas once planted could never be killed by bullets. He was shot almost instantly, no grand speech, no defiant last stand, just a sudden brutal end. One by one, the rest of the council members were executed. Comrades who had shared Sankara's dream now lay beside him in silence. And just like that, the heart of the revolution was crushed. That evening, radio stations across the country fell quiet. Then a cold clinical announcement came. President Thomas Sankara has died in an unfortunate accident. No mention of the gunshots. No names of the fallen, just the beginning of a lie that would last for decades. In the following hours, Blaise Compaoré took control of the country. He claimed it was a rectification of the revolution, that Sankara had gone too far, that his idealism had become dangerous. But the people knew better. They saw what had happened. They felt it in their bones that a light had been extinguished. Across the streets of Ouagadougou, grief turned to silence. Posters of Sankara were torn down. His speeches were banned. His name was erased from textbooks, erased from monuments. And yet something lingered. A presence. A memory. A spark that refused to die. Because even in death, Sankara had planted seeds too deep to be dug up. His dream did not die on October 15th. It went underground, hidden in the hearts of students, whispered among farmers, passed down in stories, told by parents who remembered the man who once walked among them, spoke truth to power, and died for what he believed in. Thomas Sankara was gone but not forgotten. For years, the official story in Burkina Faso was silence. Under Blaise Compaoré's iron grip, even mentioning Sankara's name could mean harassment. Or worse, statues were toppled. Photographs disappeared. Children grew up never hearing of the young president who once dreamed of a self-reliant, dignified Africa. But truth has a way of surviving. In whispered conversations, people still spoke of him, Capitaine Thomas, the man who rode a bicycle to meetings, who refused bribes, who told the world that Africa must rise not with begging bowls, but with pride. His speeches, once banned, were copied by hand, smuggled across borders and shared in university classrooms and farmer collectives alike. And outside of Burkina Faso, his legend grew. Activists from Accra to Algiers began quoting him. Young Africans wore shirts with his image in Latin America. Asia, even Europe, revolutionaries spoke of Sankara as the African Che Guevara, but he was more than that. He was his own kind of revolutionary, fiercely Pan-African, radically honest, and unshakably committed to his people. In the 2000s, as the internet spread, so did Sankara's message. Clips of his speeches, fiery, witty, courageous, went viral. His bold words at the 1987 OAU summit, where he denounced foreign debt as a new form of colonization, struck a chord with a new generation angry at the world's injustices. He had warned that if Africa didn't take a stand, it would be enslaved forever. Those words, once ignored, now rang louder than ever. But inside Burkina Faso, the silence remained until 2014. That year, after 27 years in power, Blaise Compaoré tried to change the constitution to stay longer. The people erupted. Massive protests filled the streets. Young men and women, many of whom were born after Sankara's death, carried signs that read, "Sankara lives." They set fire to the parliament. They tore down symbols of Compaoré's rule. And finally, the dictator fled. It was as if Sankara had risen again, not in flesh, but in spirit. With Compare gone, the country began to reckon with its past. In 2015, Sankara's body was exhumed. Forensic tests confirmed what many already knew. He had been riddled with bullets shot at least a dozen times. His family, his followers, his country finally had the truth. And then came justice. In 2021, after decades of silence, a historic trial began. For the first time, top officials from the 1987 coup, including Blaise Compaoré, were charged with the assassination of Thomas Sankara. The courtroom was filled with emotion survivors, family members, students, soldiers, all waiting for justice long denied. And in 2022, the verdict came. Compaoré in absentia was found guilty. Along with others, he was sentenced for the betrayal that had shaken a nation. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a spiritual one. Sankara had been silenced with bullets, but in the end, truth had spoken louder. Today, his face is painted on murals. His speeches are studied in schools. His statue stands tall in Ouagadougou, not far from where he fell. His vision of self-reliance, women's empowerment and Pan-African solidarity has become a blueprint for a generation seeking new answers to old problems. He once said, "You cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness." Maybe that's true. Maybe the world needs more of that madness, more leaders willing to live simply, to speak boldly, to act selflessly. Thomas Sankara lived only 37 years. But in that short time, he became a symbol of what Africa could be, not a continent defined by poverty, but one lifted by dignity, justice, and unity. And that is why, even in death, Sankara lives.